Pressed into clay tablets sometime around 1700 BCE, the Akkadian text known as the Atrahasis contains a passage that stops careful readers cold. The gods do not destroy humanity because humans are wicked or rebellious or ungrateful. They attempt to destroy humanity because humans have become too vital, too numerous, too persistently, unstoppably alive. And buried deeper in the same tradition, in the creation passages that precede the flood narrative, is a detail that scholars have debated with quiet intensity ever since. Something added to the clay when humanity was fashioned produced a being that exceeded its design specifications. The creators, the divine beings the Sumerians and Akkadians called the Anunnaki, looked at what they had made and felt something the texts describe with remarkable consistency as fear. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. It's probably late where you are, or at least the world has grown quiet enough that you've found your way to this. I'm genuinely glad you're here, because what we're going to explore together is one of the oldest and most quietly unsettling questions preserved in the written record. What exactly were we made to be, and did something go wrong, or unexpectedly right? The Atrahasis epic is not a fringe document or an obscure fragment. It is one of the most significant literary works recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, preserved across multiple tablet versions, studied by mainstream Assyriologists for over 150 years, and recognized by scholars including W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard, who published the definitive academic edition in 1969 as a foundational text of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The mainstream interpretation reads its creation narrative as theological literature, a sophisticated cosmological framework explaining humanity's purpose, limitations, and relationship to the divine order. That interpretation is serious, well supported, and deserves your full consideration tonight. Running alongside it, however, is a second current of interpretation, associated with researchers like Zecharia Sitchin, and more recently with scholars working at the intersection of archaeoastronomy and ancient genetics. This reading treats the Akkadian creation language not as pure metaphor, but as potentially descriptive, asking whether terms like divine blood, divine essence, and the ingredient that made humans unexpectedly capable might preserve memory of something more literal than theology alone can account for. Both interpretations have been argued by serious thinkers. Both illuminate something real about these extraordinary texts, and the tension between them is, honestly, part of what makes this subject so alive after 3,000 years. Tonight, we are not here to settle anything. We are here to explore, to sit with the questions these tablets raise, and to let the wonder of them move through us without requiring resolution. The central question is ancient and personal simultaneously. What is the quality in human beings that their own creation mythology describes as excessive, as frightening, as something that needed to be suppressed and managed and periodically reduced? What did the Akkadian scribes understand about human nature that they encoded in the oldest written story about where we came from? Take a slow breath now. Let your body settle fully into wherever you are tonight. Your bed, your chair, the particular darkness and warmth of your room. There's nothing to solve or remember. Just let your weight move downward, your shoulders ease, your hands rest open. Where are you listening from tonight? Whatever your answer, you are exactly where you need to be. If this kind of deep history brings you something worth carrying, a like or a subscription genuinely helps other people find their way here too. It takes only a moment, and it means this work can continue. Thank you sincerely. Now, let's go back past the Akkadian scribes copying their tablets by lamplight in Babylon, back past the Sumerian temple schools where the oldest versions of these stories were first committed to clay, back to a world still forming itself, still deciding what it would become. Before we can understand what the tablets say about the making of humanity, we need to understand the world those tablets describe before the making. A cosmos of divine labor and divine exhaustion, of rivers being dug by beings who eventually reached their limit and demanded something change. That world, strange and detailed and surprisingly practical in its theology, is where our story begins. Before the first city rose from the southern plain, before the first reed stylus pressed its mark into wet clay, before any human hand reached upward toward the night sky and began to name what it found there, the Akkadian tradition describes a world of undifferentiated water. Not empty water, not dead water, but water alive with divine presence, moving through darkness with the slow purposefulness of things that have always existed and expect to continue existing without interruption. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and dated in its written form to approximately 1100 BCE, but believed to preserve traditions considerably older, opens with one of the most quietly arresting passages in ancient literature. When skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together, two waters, one fresh, one salt, moving through each other in the dark, generating everything that would follow. This is not pure mythology. The geographical reality beneath the Enuma Elish's opening image is the ancient Persian Gulf Basin, where freshwater rivers flowing south from the Taurus and Zagros Mountains met the salt water of the Indian Ocean at a mixing zone that shifted dramatically with sea level changes across the Ice Age cycles. Apsu, the primordial freshwater, corresponds to the Mesopotamian river system, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and their tributaries, feeding southward into the Gulf. Tiamat, the primordial salt water, corresponds to the ocean itself. Their mixing, their generative collision, is the actual physical process that built the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, depositing the fine river silt that would eventually become the agricultural foundation of the world's first cities. The Akkadian cosmologists were not simply inventing a creation myth. They were, in some sense, describing the geology. Long before human beings entered this landscape, the southern Mesopotamian plain was itself a relatively young formation. The alluvial deposits that built it accumulated over approximately 10,000 years following the last ice age, as the Tigris and Euphrates carried silt from the northern highlands and laid it down in the warm, shallow margins of the retreating Gulf. The plain is flat to a degree that impresses even modern visitors. A drop of less than 30 meters across 600 kilometers from the northern foothills to the Gulf Coast. Standing anywhere on it, the horizon is unobstructed in every direction, and the sky above occupies a proportion of the visual field that has no equivalent in landscapes with hills or forests. The stars, on a clear night, press downward from the full 180-degree arc of the visible sky with an intimacy that must have shaped the astronomical sensibility of every culture that ever lived here. The climate of this plain between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago was measurably different from what it is today. The African humid period, which climatologists have documented through lake sediment cores and pollen records across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, produced rainfall patterns substantially wetter than the modern baseline across much of the ancient Near East. The Arabian Desert, now one of the driest environments on Earth, contained lakes, river systems, and grasslands during this period. The southern Mesopotamian plain received seasonal rains that supported diverse vegetation along the riverbanks, including the dense reed beds that would later provide the raw material for Sumerian construction, writing, and boat building. Perhaps the most significant environmental feature of this world was the Gulf itself, still rising after the Ice Age melt. Between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, the northern coast of the Persian Gulf extended approximately 200 kilometers further inland than its modern position, flooding river valleys and delta lands that had been inhabited for millennia. Communities living along those coastlines experienced the advance of the sea as a multi-generational reality, watching familiar landscapes disappear beneath salt water within living memory. The evidence hints at a persistent cultural anxiety about water and boundary, about the fragility of the land between the rivers and the sea, that would later find expression in the flood narratives pressed into clay. The stars above this rising and flooding landscape rotated through their ancient cycles with the indifference of things operating on timescales that dwarf human concern. Orion rose in the southeastern sky each winter with the same geometric precision it maintains today. Its three belt stars crossing the meridian at midnight in the deep cold of January. Its red shoulder star, Betelgeuse, burning with a warmth that ancient observers consistently associated with vitality and creative power. The constellation the Akkadians called the true shepherd of Anu, our modern Orion, was among the most significant stellar groupings in Mesopotamian astronomical theology, associated with the sky god Anu himself and with the ordering of the divine realm above the human world. Watching those stars from the flat southern plain, in a landscape where the boundary between water and land shifted from year to year and century to century, the human mind moved naturally toward the kinds of questions the Akkadian texts would eventually articulate. What is the relationship between the divine order above and the human disorder below? Who made the world as it is, and why does it contain suffering alongside abundance? What are the obligations of the created toward the Creator, and what are the obligations running in the other direction? These questions did not arrive with writing. They arrived with consciousness itself, moving through human minds long before anyone thought to press them into clay. The clay only preserved them. The asking had been going on for a very long time before that, and in the divine world the Akkadian tradition describes, those same questions were being asked from the other side of the relationship, by beings who had created a world they were increasingly struggling to maintain. The Atrahasis epic begins with a work schedule, not a hymn, not a cosmological vision, not a meditation on divine power, but a detailed account of labor assignments, of which gods were responsible for which tasks, and of how long they had been performing those tasks without relief. Tablet I opens with the great gods, the Anunnaki, sitting in elevated stations, while the lesser gods, the Igigi, perform the physical work of maintaining the world, digging the rivers, clearing the irrigation canals, piling up the soil of the riverbanks, carrying the baskets of earth that keep the agricultural system of Mesopotamia functioning. The text states explicitly that the Igigi dug the Tigris and the Euphrates, that they cut channels and defined the riverbanks, that they set up agricultural lands and built the infrastructure that makes settled life possible. This labor, the text tells us, had been continuing for 3,600 years. Sit with that number for a moment. In Sumerian mathematics, 3,600 was the Shar, the great year, a unit of cosmic time associated with the cycles of planetary motion and divine administration. Whether the number is meant literally or astronomically, the Atrahasis is establishing that the Igigi's labor was not a recent arrangement, but an ancient one, stretching back beyond ordinary reckoning. A burden carried so long that it had become woven into the fabric of divine existence. The gods were tired not from a single difficult season, but from an arrangement that had defined their existence for as long as divine memory extended. Long before the breaking point arrived, the signs of approaching crisis were accumulating. The Atrahasis describes the Igigi's condition with a specificity that feels less like mythology and more like labor documentation. Their work was heavy, their distress was great, their exertion excessive. The Akkadian words used for their suffering, translated variously as toil, hardship, and complaint, are the same words used elsewhere in the corpus to describe the condition of human laborers in difficult agricultural circumstances. The parallel is deliberate. The God's situation before the creation of humanity mirrors the human situation that humanity was created to remedy, and the Akkadian scribes who composed this text were clearly aware of the irony. The breaking point came at night, when their shift should have ended and rest should have followed. The Igigi instead gathered, counted their numbers, and made a collective decision that the text presents with the calm matter-of-factness of a historical record. They burned their tools, their spades, their baskets, their digging implements, the physical equipment of their labor were set alight. Then, in a coordinated action that modern readers might recognize as a strike combined with a demonstration, they marched to the house of Enlil, the chief god, and surrounded it before dawn. The text notes the specific hour, the middle watch of the night, when darkness is deepest, and the decision to act carries the weight of genuine resolve rather than momentary frustration. Enlil's response reveals something important about the power dynamics of the Akkadian divine world. He was afraid. The text is explicit on this point. When Enlil heard the noise of the Igigi surrounding his house, he asked his vizier Nusku what was happening, and Nusku reported the situation. Enlil called a full assembly of the great gods, the Anunnaki, to address the crisis. The assembly included Anu, the sky god, and Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters, and their debate about how to respond to the Igigi's rebellion occupies a substantial portion of Tablet 1. The labor crisis had become a constitutional crisis, a challenge to the fundamental organization of divine society. Anu's initial response was to offer negotiation. He suggested that the Igigi's complaint was legitimate, that their work was genuinely excessive, and that the divine council should acknowledge this rather than simply reassert authority. This moment in the text is worth pausing on, because it establishes the Anunnaki not as omnipotent beings indifferent to the suffering of their subordinates, but as a governing council navigating a genuine administrative problem with imperfect options and real constraints on their power. The solution that emerged from that council would change everything. Enki, whose reputation in Sumerian and Akkadian tradition rests on his combination of deep wisdom and creative ingenuity that sometimes outran his foresight, proposed creating a substitute worker, a being fashioned from available materials, capable of bearing the physical labor the Igigi refused to continue, intelligent enough to follow instructions, robust enough to survive the work, and numerous enough to maintain the agricultural and hydraulic infrastructure of the world indefinitely. The proposal was accepted. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninma and Mami in different versions of the tradition, was assigned to lead the creation process. Enki would provide the technical specifications. What they made next was not precisely what they intended. The philosophical weight of that outcome, the gap between the design tool and the actual result, is the central intellectual tension of the entire Atrahasis tradition, and it echoes forward through every subsequent Mesopotamian text that touches on the nature of humanity. Something in the making exceeded the design. Something in the created exceeded the creator's intention. And the world that resulted from that excess is the world we are still, quietly navigating tonight. Enki's temple at Eridu, the Iabzu, the House of the Abyss, sat at the southern edge of the Sumerian world, oriented toward the deep waters that Enki was understood to inhabit and command. The temple's innermost chamber, according to the textual tradition, opened directly above the Abzu, the primordial underground ocean from which all fresh water ultimately derived. Visiting priests would have felt, in that chamber, a particular atmospheric quality, the slight coolness rising from the water table below the temple floor, the smell of damp stone mixed with cedar oil from the ritual lamps, the sense of depth immediately beneath the surface, of layers below the visible layer that contained things of consequence. This was Enki's domain, not the sky, not the storm, not the political administration of the divine council, but depth, hidden knowledge, the creative possibilities concealed beneath ordinary surfaces. Enki's character in the Akkadian and Sumerian literary tradition is distinctive and consistent across texts spanning more than 1,000 years of composition. He is clever rather than powerful, wise rather than authoritative, inclined toward solutions that achieve their goals through indirection and creative reinterpretation rather than direct force. He is also, and the texts are candid about this, occasionally reckless with his own ingenuity, producing outcomes he did not fully anticipate because his attention was focused on the elegance of the solution rather than all of its downstream consequences. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, circa 1800 BCE, shows him consuming plants whose properties he has not fully investigated and suffering the consequences. The myth of Enki and the world order shows him distributing divine functions and responsibilities to other gods with a generosity that later requires adjustment. He is brilliant and somewhat careless, and the creation of humanity reflects both qualities. The material specification for humanity's construction appears in the Atrahasis with a precision that mainstream Assyriologists read as theological symbolism, and alternative researchers read as something closer to technical description. Clay from above the Abzu was to be mixed with the flesh and blood of a god, specifically a god who possessed what the text calls Temu, a term translated variously as intelligence, personality, or rational spirit. The god chosen for this purpose was one of the Igigi, who had participated in the rebellion, a being whose Temu would be incorporated into the clay mixture, providing the created being with the capacity for the intelligent labor the Anunnaki required. Ninma, the mother goddess, would shape the physical form. Enki would provide the essential ingredient. The name of the slain god is given in some versions of the text as Wi'ilu, or Wela, meaning the one who has intelligence. The deliberateness of this choice is significant. The Anunnaki did not select a random divine being for incorporation into the human design. They selected specifically a being whose defining quality was cognitive capacity, because cognitive capacity was precisely what the new worker needed to perform complex agricultural and hydraulic labor effectively. The intelligence was, in the original design, a functional requirement, a tool specification rather than a gift. It became something else entirely. Ninma's role in the creation process is described in the Atrahasis with a tenderness that sits somewhat unexpectedly alongside the utilitarian framing of the project. She is called upon to recite an incantation over the clay mixture, to shape it with her hands, to breathe life into the formed figure with the deliberateness of a craftsperson who takes genuine care with her work. The text describes her as the midwife of the gods, a title that places the creation of humanity within the framework of birth rather than manufacture, suggesting that whatever emerged from the clay mixture was understood as genuinely alive in a way that a simple constructed tool would not be. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninma, a separate but related text, provides additional texture to the creation process. In this version, Enki and Ninma engage in a kind of divine crafting competition after considerable quantities of divine beer have been consumed at a celestial banquet. Ninma fashions 6 human variants, each with a specific physical difference from the standard design. A man who cannot bend his hands, a woman who cannot give birth, a being with no male or female organ, a man who cannot hold his urine. For each variant, Enki finds a social role, demonstrating that even imperfect creations have functions within a properly organized society. The text reads as both a theological explanation for human physical variation and, perhaps, a record of experimental iterations in the creation process. Scholars debate whether the Enki and Ninma text and the Atrahasis creation sequence represent a single tradition in different versions, or 2 genuinely distinct mythological strands that were later harmonized by scribal editors. W.G. Lambert, whose 1969 critical edition of the Atrahasis remains the standard academic reference, argued for a complex editorial history involving multiple source traditions, each preserving different aspects of an older oral tradition about human origins. This matters for our purposes tonight, because it suggests that the Akkadian creation narrative is not a single composed text with a single author's intent, but a convergence of multiple independent traditions, all pointing toward the same central event, a creation that produced more than its creators anticipated. Take a slow breath here. What we have established tonight, across these opening sections, is the context for a question that the Akkadian tablets will press more urgently as we move deeper into them. A divine labor crisis, a creative solution, a material specification combining clay with divine cognitive essence, and a result that, by the evidence of the texts themselves, surprised and eventually alarmed the beings who designed it. We have not yet reached the alarm. We have not yet arrived at the passages where Enlil cannot sleep, where the divine council convenes in emergency session, where the gods look at the proliferating, vital, unstoppably alive human population and reach for increasingly severe responses. But we are moving toward that moment, steadily and without hurry, the way the rivers of southern Mesopotamia move toward the sea, carrying everything they have gathered from the mountains and the plains, depositing it layer by layer in the warm delta where fresh water meets salt, where the old order dissolves into the new, where something that did not exist before takes shape in the dark and begins slowly to breathe. Somewhere in the basement storage of the British Museum, in a climate-controlled room maintaining approximately 18 degrees Celsius and 50% relative humidity, sits a clay tablet approximately 16 centimeters wide and 11 centimeters tall, its surface covered in neat columns of cuneiform script pressed into buff-colored clay that fired to hardness in a conflagration roughly 2,600 years ago. The tablet is one of three that together constitute the Atrahasis epic in its most complete surviving form, recovered from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard's excavations between 1845 and 1851. Its surface is not perfectly preserved. Sections are missing, edges are damaged, and several passages require reconstruction from parallel tablet fragments held in collections in Philadelphia, Baghdad, and Istanbul. But what survives is sufficient to establish its extraordinary content, and scholars have been reading it with increasing comprehension and increasing philosophical discomfort since the mid-19th century. The three tablets of the Atrahasis epic cover, in sequence, the creation of humanity, the divine attempts to reduce human population through plague, drought, and famine, and finally the Great Flood and its aftermath. The colophon, the scribal notation at the end of the text, identifies the scribe as Nur-Aya and gives a date equivalent to approximately 1635 BCE, placing the composition in the Old Babylonian period. Nur-Aya was not the author of the material he copied. He was a transmitter, a link in a chain of scribal transmission that stretched backward from his clay tablet to originals that the internal linguistic evidence of the text places considerably earlier, likely in the Ur III period around 2100 to 2000 BCE, and possibly drawing on oral traditions older still. The physical material of the tablets reveals process as clearly as content. Cuneiform clay tablets were shaped by hand from fine alluvial silt mixed with organic temper worked to a consistency that held impressions cleanly without sticking to the stylus. A fresh tablet had a particular smell, something between wet earth and river mud, and a coolness to the touch that warmed within minutes of being held. The scribe worked quickly, because clay dries from the surface inward, and the optimal working window for fine inscription was perhaps 30 to 45 minutes for a tablet of this size. Nur Aya, trained from childhood in the Aduba scribal school, would have completed his columns with the automatic precision of deep practice, his reed stylus moving through the signs at a speed that preserved their accuracy without requiring conscious attention to individual letter forms. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that provides the cosmological framework within which the Atrahasis creation narrative operates, survives in 7 tablets recovered primarily from Nineveh and dated to the first millennium BCE, though its content again reflects traditions traced by scholars, including Wilfrid Lambert, back to at least the Old Babylonian period. Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish contains the creation of humanity in its Babylonian version, where the god Marduk proposes the creation of human beings from the blood of the defeated divine rebel Kingu, specifically to bear the service of the gods and free the Anunnaki from labor. The parallel with the Atrahasis is direct and acknowledged by all scholars working in the field. These are variant versions of the same foundational tradition, preserved through different scribal lineages, but pointing toward a common origin. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest Sumerian flood and creation text, survives in a single fragmentary tablet from Nippur, housed in the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania, dated to the Old Babylonian period, but carrying Sumerian linguistic features suggesting its composition in the Ur III period or earlier. The tablet's condition is poor, with significant lacunae at the most critical points of the narrative, and the creation section is particularly fragmentary. What survives establishes that humanity was created to tend the gods' irrigation canals and maintain the agricultural infrastructure consistent with the Atrahasis tradition, and that the world before the flood contained both human and divine inhabitants organized in a hierarchical relationship, whose details the damaged text only partially preserves. What unites these 3 textual traditions, the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and the Eridu Genesis, is not merely their shared narrative elements, but their shared theological assumption that humanity's creation was a practical response to a specific problem, that the created being was defined by its functional relationship to the divine, and that something in the created being exceeded or deviated from its functional design in ways that generated ongoing divine concern. Mainstream Assyriologists read this excess as a theological device establishing human dignity within a service cosmology, the idea that bearing divine essence elevates the servant rather than merely obligating them. The alternative reading treats the excess as literally descriptive, as the texts attempt to account for qualities in human beings that seemed disproportionate to their assigned role. Both readings agree on the basic textual facts. The tablets say what they say. The language of divine ingredient, cognitive essence, and subsequent divine anxiety about human vitality is present in the text, not imported by modern interpreters. The question is what level of the text is doing the primary work. And that question remains, with genuine intellectual honesty, unresolved. Even now, new tablet fragments from sites across Iraq and Syria are periodically identified in museum collections, matched with known texts, and translated for the first time. The Atrahasis tradition may yet yield additional passages that clarify the creation narrative's details or add dimensions not visible in the currently known corpus. The tablets are not finished speaking. The conversation they began approximately 4,000 years ago is still, in the most literal sense, ongoing. The reading room of the British Museum's Department of Oriental Antiquities in the winter of 1872 was heated inadequately against the London cold, lit by gas lamps that cast a yellowish working light across the long tables, and smelled of the particular combination of old clay, lamp oil, and coal smoke that characterized Victorian institutional interiors. It was here, on an afternoon in November of that year, that a 30-year-old self-taught cuneiformist named George Smith sat with a tablet fragment from the Nineveh collection, translating a passage he had not previously examined, and read something that caused him to stand up from his chair and begin walking rapidly around the room. Smith had been employed by the British Museum since 1867, initially to sort and classify the tens of thousands of tablet fragments recovered from Nineveh, a task for which his extraordinary natural aptitude for pattern recognition in cuneiform signs made him uniquely suited despite his lack of formal academic training. He had taught himself to read cuneiform from published grammars and vocabularies while working as a banknote engraver, spending his lunch hours at the museum studying the collections before eventually being offered a position there. By 1872, he had worked through substantial portions of the Nineveh material and had begun to recognize thematic connections between fragments that the museum's official scholars had not yet mapped. On that November afternoon, the fragment in his hands contained a detailed account of a great flood, a divine warning, a vessel, 7 days of inundation, a bird sent to test the waters, and a hero emerging to offer sacrifice to the gods. The text predated Genesis by more than 1,000 years in its written form. Smith's colleague, the Egyptologist Samuel Birch, was present in the reading room and later described Smith's reaction. The rapid walking, the excited and somewhat incoherent speech, and the reportedly dramatic removal of several items of clothing in the heat of the moment, a detail that has been repeated in every account of the discovery since, and that Smith himself apparently confirmed. He presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology on December 3, 1872, to an audience that included Prime Minister William Gladstone, and the subsequent newspaper coverage produced a sensation. The Daily Telegraph offered the substantial sum of 1,000 guineas to fund an expedition to Nineveh, specifically to search for missing fragments of the flood tablet. Smith led the excavation himself in the spring of 1873, with no formal archaeological training, and found the missing fragment within the first 5 days of digging. The resolution of Smith's discovery was not simply the recovery of a flood narrative. It was the opening of a door that has not closed since. The recognition that the biblical flood story had Mesopotamian predecessors led directly to the broader realization, developing through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, That much of the theological and cosmological content of the Hebrew Bible was in active dialogue with Mesopotamian literary tradition. And that realization, in turn, drew sustained scholarly attention to the creation narratives of the Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, which proved to be, if anything, even more theologically provocative than the flood account. The specific provocation was the creation material's portrait of divine motivation. Smith's flood discovery suggested that the biblical narrative had ancient Near Eastern sources. The creation material suggested that those sources contained a version of human origins substantially different in its theological implications from the Genesis account, one in which humanity was created not from divine love or deliberate blessing, but from divine administrative necessity, one in which the creators were not omnipotent, but overworked, not serene, but eventually frightened by what they had made. Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University, whose 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, remains a foundational text in Mesopotamian religious studies, described the Atrahasis creation narrative as encoding a theology of human ambivalence, in which the created being occupies a position of genuine dignity by virtue of its divine ingredient, while simultaneously being defined by its service function and constrained by deliberately imposed limitations. Jacobson read the divine anxiety about human vitality as a theological acknowledgement that bearing divine essence makes humanity genuinely powerful, powerful enough to require management, powerful enough that its unconstrained expression would alter the divine order. That reading is serious and carefully argued. It also leaves open a question that the text itself seems to raise with deliberate persistence. If the divine ingredient was intended only as a functional cognitive tool, why did it produce something that the gods found alarming? Tools do not frighten their makers. Servants do not require periodic destruction to manage their populations. Something in the making exceeded the design, and the Akkadian scribes who preserved this tradition clearly understood that excess as the central, defining fact of human existence. The tablets that George Smith began reading in that London winter have not finished yielding their implications. Even now, the Atrahasis continues to generate serious scholarly debate about what exactly the Akkadian tradition understood humanity to be, and why it consistently described that understanding in the language of excess, of surprise, and of fear. The Akkadian word etemu appears in the Atrahasis creation passage, in a context that has generated more scholarly debate per syllable than almost any other term in the Mesopotamian corpus. Translated variously as ghost, spirit, personality, or cognitive essence, it denotes the animating principle that persists after death, the aspect of a being that is not merely physical, but genuinely present in the world, in a way that outlasts the body. When the Atrahasis specifies that the etemu of the slain god, Ilu, was incorporated into the clay mixture from which humanity was fashioned, it is making a statement about the nature of human consciousness that carries implications the text's Babylonian readers would have recognized immediately. Human beings are not simply animated clay. They carry within them something that belongs to the divine category of existence. The specific god chosen for this incorporation was not selected arbitrarily. The text's designation of Ilu as a being who possessed Temu, the rational intelligence, as his defining characteristic, establishes a direct causal chain between the divine cognitive quality being incorporated and the human cognitive quality that results. The Anunnaki were engineering a specific outcome, of being intelligent enough to manage complex agricultural and hydraulic systems, to follow multi-step instructions, to organize its own labor without constant divine supervision. What they received was a being that did all of this, and then, over generations, did considerably more. The Akkadian creation terminology uses several distinct terms for the components of human constitution, and mainstream Assyriology has mapped these carefully. The Temu provides rational cognition. The Etamu provides the animating spirit that survives death. The Zakik denotes the dream soul, the aspect of consciousness that travels during sleep. The Napishtu, borrowed from the Semitic linguistic tradition, denotes the life breath, the basic vital animation. Together, these constitute a model of human consciousness as layered, as containing multiple distinct components with different origins and different destinies, some returning to the divine realm at death, others dispersing into the earth, others lingering in the world as the ghosts and spirits that Mesopotamian ritual tradition spent considerable energy managing. This is not, it should be noted, a primitive or unsophisticated model of consciousness. It distinguishes between different functional aspects of mental life in ways that anticipate modern cognitive science's interest in separating the components of what we experience as unified consciousness. The Akkadian scribes who maintained and elaborated this terminology across centuries of scribal tradition were engaged in something recognizable as careful thinking about the nature of mind, informed by both theological tradition and, presumably, by the kind of sustained observation of human behavior and human death that any thoughtful person in any era is positioned to conduct. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial scholar whose 1976 book, The 12th Planet, proposed reading the Anunnaki creation narrative as a literal account of genetic intervention by an extraterrestrial civilization, drew heavily on this terminology in constructing his argument. Sitchin translated the creation passages as describing the mixing of Anunnaki genetic material with existing hominid biological material to produce an upgraded worker species, reading terms like divine blood and divine flesh as references to genetic material rather than spiritual essence. His translations have been criticized by credentialed Assyriologists, including Michael Heiser, who argued in detail that Sitchin's readings frequently depart from standard linguistic interpretation in ways that support his thesis rather than following from the evidence. Those criticisms are substantive and deserve acknowledgement. What the mainstream and alternative interpretation share, despite their differences in method and conclusion, is agreement that the Akkadian texts describe something added to the human constitution that was not present in the raw material, that this addition came from a divine or superior source, and that it produced capabilities in the resulting being that exceeded the functional requirements of the original design. The disagreement is about the nature of that addition: spiritual essence or genetic material, theological category or biological substance. The texts themselves use language that maps onto both interpretive frameworks with enough ambiguity that neither can claim decisive textual authority over the other. Consider what this ambiguity itself might mean. The Babylonian scribes who maintain the Atrahasis tradition across centuries of copying were not careless with language. They were among the most precisely trained verbal technicians of the ancient world, working within a scribal tradition that treated the exact preservation of textual wording as a sacred obligation. If the creation terminology is ambiguous between spiritual and material readings, that ambiguity may be intentional, a deliberate preservation of multiple layers of meaning within a single set of terms, consistent with the Nisirtu tradition of Babylonian scholarship that maintained restricted inner meanings alongside publicly accessible outer ones. The quality that resulted from this formula, whatever its ultimate nature, produced a being that could name the stars, build cities, compose literature, conduct astronomical observations accurate to modern standards, and ask, with genuine philosophical seriousness, what it was and where it came from. That last capacity, the capacity for self-questioning, for directing the tools of cognition back toward their own origin, may be precisely what the Akkadian tradition identified as the excess, the quality that exceeded the functional design specification and generated the divine anxiety the texts describe with such consistent and patient attention. We are carrying those same questions tonight, in the same neural architecture that the Akkadian scribes were attempting to describe when they pressed the word etemu into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The question has not changed. Only the medium carrying it forward through time has changed, from clay to papyrus to paper, to the quiet transmission of a voice in the dark, moving through the same old mystery, with the same old inadequate but irresistible human desire to understand what, exactly, we are. The Akkadian word at the center of this section's drama is rigmu. It appears in tablet one of the Atrahasis at the moment when the newly created human population has been alive long enough to establish itself, to organize its labor, to begin the agricultural and hydraulic work for which it was designed, and to do something else entirely that its designers had not anticipated with sufficient seriousness: multiply. The text states that 1,200 years passed after humanity's creation before the first divine crisis emerged. In those 1,200 years, the human population grew from its initial small founding group to a number and density that generated rigmu, a sound, a clamor, a vital noise that rose from the human settlements of the southern plain and reach the divine realm above with enough force and persistence to prevent Enlil, the chief god, from sleeping. Rigmu is not simply loud noise. The word carries, in other Akkadian contexts, the sense of the full expressive vitality of a living population, its arguments and celebrations, its ritual music, and its ordinary conversation, its agricultural activity, and its reproductive success. The entire acoustic signature of a thriving community going about its existence with the unself-conscious energy of beings that do not yet know they are being observed with concern from above. The Atrahasis uses the same word elsewhere to describe the outcry of people in distress, which gives the term a deliberate ambiguity. The noise that disturbs Enlil is simultaneously the sound of human flourishing and the sound of human suffering, and the text does not resolve which dimension is primary. Imagine the southern Mesopotamian plain at night, roughly 1,200 years after humanity's creation, by whatever calendar the Akkadian tradition intends. Hundreds of settlements are visible from above as clusters of lamplight against the dark plain. their fields marked by the geometry of irrigation channels catching moonlight, their populations sleeping, working night shifts at the canals, tending animals, conducting the nocturnal rituals that Mesopotamian religious practice distributed across all hours of the day. The collective sound of all this activity, rising through the warm night air of the river valley, would be the sound of a species that has found its environmental niche and occupied it with total commitment. This demographic reality has an archaeological correlate that is genuinely striking. The southern Mesopotamian plain between 6000 and 3000 BCE shows, in its settlement pattern data, one of the most rapid and sustained population increases recorded anywhere in the pre-modern world. Survey data compiled by Robert Adams of the University of Chicago, published in his landmark 1981 study, Heartland of Cities, documents the expansion of settled agricultural communities across the Mesopotamian alluvium in a pattern consistent with compounding population growth, supported by increasingly sophisticated irrigation agriculture. Adams identified more than 2,000 ancient sites in his survey area alone, ranging from small farmsteads to substantial urban centers, distributed across the plain in a density that implies a human population numbering in the hundreds of thousands by the early 3rd millennium BCE. The Atrahasis was not inventing a demographic crisis. It was reflecting one that its scribes could observe in their own landscape, reading backward from the visible abundance of human presence to a mythological moment when that abundance first became conspicuous from a divine perspective. The 1,200-year interval before Enlil's first complaint may reflect actual cultural memory of a period of sustained population growth, encoded in the theological framework of the text as the interval between creation and divine response. Enlil's response to the Rigmu reveals something important about his character, as the Akkadian texts consistently portray it. He does not investigate. He does not descend to examine the human settlements and assess whether their activity represents a genuine threat or simply the expected functioning of the species he helped authorize into existence. He simply announces that the noise is intolerable and that it must stop. His solution, communicated to the divine assembly, is to send the god Namtar, the deity of plague and death, to reduce the human population to a more manageable level. The response is disproportionate, administrative rather than ethical, concerned with the inconvenience to divine comfort, rather than any moral assessment of human behavior. This portrait of Enlil as a being motivated primarily by irritation at disruption to his own rest is one of the most consistent features of his characterization across the Mesopotamian literary corpus. He is not evil in the tradition's presentation, but he is also not particularly concerned with the well-being of the beings whose labor maintains the world he administers. The Atrahasis presents this without apparent criticism, as simply the nature of the relationship between divine administrator and human workforce, a relationship defined by function rather than affection. What the text does not explain, and what scholars have noted as a significant gap, is why the divine council accepted Enlil's framing without apparent debate. The same council that deliberated carefully about the Igigi's labor complaint, that heard Anu's argument for acknowledging the legitimacy of the workers' grievance, simply ratified Enlil's decision to send plague against a population that had committed no offense beyond existing vigorously. The silence of the other gods on this point suggests either editorial compression of a longer debate or a deliberate theological statement about the arbitrariness of the relationship between humanity and its divine administrators, a statement the text leaves for its readers to draw their own conclusions about. Something in that silence has carried forward through 4,000 years of transmission, and it arrives tonight still unresolved, still asking its quiet question about the nature of the power that humanity was created to serve. A temple astronomer in Babylon, working sometime around 650 BCE in the Esagila temple complex dedicated to the god Marduk, would have begun his day before sunrise. His name, drawn from the administrative records of the period, might have been Nabu Ahe-Iddin, a name meaning Nabu has given brothers, common among the scholarly priestly class of the Neo-Babylonian period. His responsibilities included the observation and recording of planetary positions, the calculation of lunar eclipse predictions using the Saros cycle of 18 years and 11 days that Babylonian astronomers had refined over centuries, and the interpretation of celestial omens for the royal court. He was by any reasonable definition a scientist, working within an institutional framework that had been accumulating observational data for longer than any other scientific tradition on Earth. On a particular morning, as the eastern sky above Babylon's mud brick skyline began to pale from black to deep indigo, Nabu Ahe-Iddin stood on the roof of the temple's observation platform, approximately 15 meters above the street level of the city, and recorded the position of Jupiter against the background stars using a graduated measurement instrument and a trained eye capable of resolving angular separations of less than 1 degree. He noted the observation on a small clay tablet using a compressed notation system that could record a night's worth of astronomical data in a few dozen cuneiform signs. Then, before the morning rituals began, he spent 30 minutes reading a section of the Atrahasis from a library tablet as part of the ongoing scribal education that continued throughout a Babylonian scholar's professional life. He paused on the passage where the divine council convened to discuss the human rigmu, and read it with the particular attention of someone who spent his professional life observing the sky the gods were said to inhabit. Whatever he thought about the theological claims of the text, he pressed his stylus into a fresh tablet and copied the passage carefully, adding his name to the colophon as the tradition required. The copy he made that morning may still exist somewhere beneath the soil of modern Hilla, waiting for an excavation that has not yet reached it. The Divine Council's emergency session, described in the Atrahasis, has a specific structure that rewards careful attention. Enlil raises the problem. The assembled Anunnaki discuss responses. What is notably absent from the recorded debate is any suggestion that the human population should simply be addressed directly, that Enlil should descend to the human settlements and explain the problem, that humanity should be informed of its transgression and given the opportunity to modify its behavior. The gods do not consider communicating with their creation about the creation's effect on divine comfort. They consider only various mechanisms for reducing human numbers without the creation's knowledge or consent. This management style, secretive, unilateral, implemented through plague and drought and famine rather than through direct instruction, reveals an anxiety that goes beyond mere irritation at noise. You manage through concealment what you cannot manage through authority. The Anunnaki's preference for indirect intervention suggests that direct confrontation with the human population was, for reasons the text does not fully articulate, not a viable option. Something about what humanity had become made straightforward divine command less reliable than it should have been, for a species designed to receive and follow divine instruction. The three escalating interventions the Anunnaki deploy before resorting to the flood are each described in the Atrahasis with specific physical detail. The first, the plague sent by Namtar, reduces human population, but fails to eliminate the Rigmu, because Enki, working through the human sage Atrahasis, advises humanity to concentrate all worship on Namtar alone, flattering the plague god into withdrawing his affliction. The second, a drought and famine engineered by the sky god Adad, withholding rain, reduces the human population further, but again fails because Enki advises concentrating worship on Adad to restore the rains. The third, a more comprehensive famine, combining drought with the blocking of all food sources from the sea, comes closest to achieving Enlil's goal, but is again circumvented by Enki's intervention. The pattern across these three attempts reveals something the text seems to want its readers to notice. Humanity, guided by its wisest member, finds a way through every obstacle the gods construct. Not through violence, not through direct confrontation with divine power, but through understanding, through correctly identifying which divine being controls each affliction and directing appropriate ritual attention toward that being. The human response to divine persecution is sophisticated, adaptive, and effective. It is exactly the kind of response that a being possessing functional divine intelligence would develop under pressure. Enlil's mounting frustration across these failed interventions moves, in the text's careful presentation, from administrative irritation towards something closer to genuine alarm. The species he authorized into existence is not behaving like a tool. It is behaving like an agent, navigating divine pressure with a flexibility and resourcefulness that tools do not possess. The question the text raises, but does not directly answer, is whether Enlil recognized, at some point during these escalating interventions, that the species he was trying to manage had been given capacities that made it in principle unmanageable by the methods available to him. The flood was not a punishment. It was an attempt to start over. And the fact that it failed to achieve even that goal, because Enki warned Atrahasis and the essential knowledge survived, suggests that the Anunnaki's fear was not unfounded. What they had made could not be unmade, not completely, not permanently. The inheritance had already passed into the world after the flood recedes in the Atrahasis, and Atrahasis emerges from his vessel onto a landscape of silence and mud, and the gods assemble to assess what has survived and what has been lost. Something interesting happens in the text's narrative pacing. It slows. The drama of the flood, rendered with considerable atmospheric intensity in Tablet 3, gives way to a careful, almost bureaucratic discussion among the divine council about the terms under which humanity will be permitted to continue existing. The discussion reveals that the Anunnaki have learned something from the failure of their previous population management attempts, and what they have learned is that eliminating humanity entirely is not achievable. What might be achievable is redesigning the conditions of human existence to impose inherent limitations that do not require ongoing divine intervention to maintain. The post-flood human design specifications appear in the Atrahasis with a specificity that mainstream scholars read as a theological explanation for the human condition, and alternative researchers read as something closer to a biological design document. Nintu, the mother goddess, announces that she will establish 3 categories among human beings going forward: those who give birth, those who do not, and those who are taken by a demon in infancy. The text specifies that certain women will be designated as Naditu, temple women who observe celibacy as a religious obligation, effectively removing their reproductive capacity from the population's contribution to overall fertility. Additional mortality controls are introduced through the figure of the Pashitu demon, who takes infants before they can contribute to population growth. These are not metaphors for natural mortality. They are described as deliberate design choices implemented by the Divine Council, specifically in response to the population problem that led to the flood. The Anunnaki, having failed to eliminate humanity, are now engineering the conditions of its existence to ensure that its growth remains within tolerable limits. Humanity is being redesigned in response to having exceeded its original design. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the 12-tablet masterwork of Akkadian literature, whose standard version was compiled by the scholar-priest Sinlike Unini around 1200 BCE, frames the limitation question from the human perspective with a directness and emotional force that the Atrahasis, with its divine council perspective, does not attempt. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, according to the text's own description, spends the last half of the epic in active pursuit of immortality following the death of his companion Enkidu. His journey takes him to the ends of the world, across the waters of death, to the dwelling place of the flood survivor Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life. Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim the direct question, why must humans die? Imagine Gilgamesh at the shore of the waters of death, his lion-skin clothing worn to rags by his months of travel, his face marked by grief that has not softened since Enkidu's death. He is the greatest king of the greatest city of the ancient world, 2/3 divine by his own tradition's reckoning, and he is standing at the boundary of the human realm, asking the fundamental question that his divine inheritance has made unanswerable by ordinary human means. The waters before him are described as unnavigable without specific knowledge. The ferryman Urshanabi is the only being who crosses them regularly, and on the other side sits the answer, in the form of a man who survived the flood and was given the gift that Gilgamesh seeks. Utnapishtim's answer, delivered across several tablets of careful dialogue, does not satisfy Gilgamesh's desire, but does satisfy the text's philosophical requirements. Immortality was given to Utnapishtim as a unique exception, a reward for a specific act of survival that the gods are not prepared to repeat. The general principle, maintained as deliberate divine policy, is that human beings die. The Anunnaki hold the tablets of life and death, the text explains, and Enlil and Shamash together determine the length of each human life. This is not an accident of nature, but an administered condition, a policy choice maintained by the same council that designed the post-flood population controls in the Atrahasis. The Adapa myth, preserved in fragments from Tel El Amarna in Egypt, dating to approximately 1350 BCE, provides the most explicit account of immortality being deliberately withheld from a human being who might otherwise have claimed it. Adapa, a sage of Eridu and a protege of Enki, breaks the wing of the south wind during a fishing expedition and is summoned before the sky god Anu for judgment. Enki instructs Adapa before his journey to heaven he should refuse the food and water of death that Anu will offer him as a test. When Adapa arrives in heaven and is offered food and water, he refuses, as Enki instructed. The food and water he refused were, in fact, the food and water of life, the substance of immortality. Enki had given Adapa correct instructions for avoiding death, but had ensured through those same instructions that Adapa would not accidentally acquire eternal life. Why would Enki, humanity's patron and protector, engineer the denial of immortality to his own most capable human protege? The text does not answer this directly. One interpretation holds that Enki understood, better than any other divine being, that the combination of human cognitive capacity and human immortality would produce a being genuinely comparable to the gods, and that this combination would fundamentally alter the divine-human relationship in ways the cosmic order was not designed to accommodate. The limitation of human lifespan was not cruelty. It was the maintenance of a boundary that the creation's unexpected success had made necessary to enforce deliberately. Beneath the mythological framework, beneath the divine council deliberations, and the journeys to the ends of the earth, the Akkadian tradition is engaging with a question that remains genuinely unresolved in modern philosophy and cognitive science. What is the relationship between consciousness, mortality, and the limits of what a being can become? The scribes who pressed these stories into clay were not simply preserving theology. They were thinking with considerable sophistication about the nature of the thing they were. The Esagila temple complex in Babylon, as it stood in the 7th century BCE at the height of the Neo-Babylonian period, covered an area of approximately 4 hectares within the city's sacred precinct, a vast mud brick structure whose outer walls reached 15 meters in height and whose interior spaces included the great sanctuary of Marduk, storage magazines holding the god's material wealth, administrative offices managing the temple's extensive agricultural estates, workshops for the production of ritual goods, and residential quarters for the several hundred priests, priestesses, scholars, musicians, and administrators who constituted the temple's permanent staff. The ziggurat adjacent to the Esagila, the Anunnaki, whose name translates as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in 7 stages to a height estimated by scholars at approximately 90 meters, making it the tallest structure in the ancient Near East during its period of completion, and almost certainly the structure that gave rise to the Tower of Babel tradition in the Hebrew Bible. Life within this institution was organized entirely around the premise that the great god Marduk was a living being residing in the temple's inner sanctuary, requiring the same daily care and maintenance that any great king required. The morning ritual, documented in detail in Babylonian temple administrative texts, began before sunrise with the cleaning and dressing of the cult statue, a seated figure of Marduk, approximately human in scale, fashioned from precious wood and overlaid with gold and lapis lazuli, wearing garments of fine linen that were changed daily and laundered by dedicated temple workers. The statue was presented with a morning meal of bread, beer, fish, birds, dates, and other foods in quantities specified by the ritual calendar, arranged on offering tables before the sanctuary's inner doors. Imagine entering the outer court of the Asagala on a morning in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 600 BCE. The air carries the mingled scents of cedar resin burning in the temple lamps, fresh bread from the bakehouse whose smoke rises above the eastern wing of the complex, and the green river smell of the Euphrates, flowing 400 meters to the west, carried on the morning breeze across the city. The outer court's paving stones are polished limestone, cool beneath sandaled feet at this hour, and the sound of the tigi instrument, a large harp-like instrument associated with Marduk's worship, drifts from the inner sanctuary where the morning hymns have already begun. The Kalu priests, whose specific professional function was the performance of lamentation music to soothe the emotions of the gods, were among the most highly trained specialists in the Babylonian temple system. Their repertoire included compositions in the Amisal dialect of Sumerian, a form of the language preserved specifically for liturgical use centuries after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken vernacular, creating a linguistic distinction between sacred and ordinary speech that preserved the archaic register as a marker of ritual seriousness. A senior Kalu priest would have spent 15 to 20 years in formal education before being qualified to perform independently, mastering not only the musical and textual content of the lamentation repertoire, but also the interpretive tradition that explained which divine emotional states each composition was designed to address. The administrative records of Babylonian temple economies, preserved in thousands of clay tablets from sites including Nippur, Uruk, and Babylon itself, reveal an institution of extraordinary economic complexity. The Asagala owned agricultural land extending across several surrounding provinces, managed by temple administrators who collected rents in grain and silver, maintained irrigation infrastructure, organized seasonal labor for planting and harvest, and distributed rations to the temple's permanent workforce. A senior temple administrator's day involved reviewing accounts, resolving disputes between tenant farmers and temple officials, allocating resources for upcoming festivals, and corresponding with the royal palace about the temple's financial obligations to the state. The sacred and the commercial were not separate domains. They were the same domain, administered with the same bureaucratic precision. The ration tablets from Nippur's Ur three-period temple archives, dating to approximately 2050 BCE, record daily food allocations for workers with a specificity that allows modern historians to reconstruct the diet and social hierarchy of the institution in considerable detail. A male laborer received approximately 60 sila of barley per month, roughly 60 liters, along with smaller amounts of oil and wool for clothing. Female workers received 30 to 40 sila. Skilled craftspeople and administrators received supplements of fish, meat, and beer in quantities that reflected their institutional status. The god at the center of this economy received offerings calculated to exceed what the most senior human official received. Establishing through food allocation the precise position of the divine within the institutional hierarchy. The stars above Babylon that these temple workers watched each night were not decorative, they were administrative. The Babylonian astronomical tradition, which had been accumulating observational data for centuries before the Neo-Babylonian period, provided the temple with the information needed to schedule the festival calendar, to predict eclipses that required specific ritual responses, and to generate the astrological reports that the royal court required for political and military decision-making. The planets were understood as the Anunnaki themselves, moving through the sky in patterns that communicated divine intentions to those trained to read them. Jupiter was Marduk, Venus was Ishtar, Saturn was Ninurta, Mars was Nergal. Watching the sky was, in the most literal theological sense, watching the gods. Beneath all of this elaborate institutional life, beneath the ritual precision and the economic administration and the astronomical observation, ran the foundational premise of the Atrahasis. Humanity exists to serve. The temple was the mechanism through which that service was organized, made visible, and sustained across generations. And yet the people who operated within this mechanism were also composing poetry, conducting scientific observation, maintaining libraries, educating children, arguing about theology, and asking, in their scribal commentaries and their wisdom literature and their lament compositions, the same questions the Atrahasis raises. What are we exactly? And does the role we have been assigned fully account for the thing we find ourselves to be? That question, asked quietly in the margins of administrative tablets and in the restricted commentary texts of the temple libraries, points toward the hidden dimensions of Akkadian thought that we have not yet fully explored tonight. Beneath the surface of modern paleoanthropology, beneath the careful language of peer-reviewed papers and conference presentations, there is a set of findings about human origins that mainstream scientists acknowledge with measured precision, and that alternative researchers cite with considerably less restraint, but that both groups agree represent genuinely unusual features of the human evolutionary story. The findings concern the pace and nature of human cognitive development, the genetic evidence for dramatic population bottlenecks, and the specific anomalies in human biology that distinguish our species from our closest evolutionary relatives in ways that standard gradualist models have difficulty explaining with complete satisfaction. None of these findings require supernatural explanation. All of them reward patient attention. The human brain presents the most immediately striking anomaly. Weighing approximately 1.4 kilograms in an adult, it consumes roughly 20% of the body's total metabolic energy, despite constituting only about 2% of body mass. No other organ in the human body, and no equivalent structure in any other known species, maintains this ratio of metabolic cost to body proportion. Evolutionary biology explains this through the compensating advantages of enhanced cognitive capacity, the ability to plan, to use language, to organize complex social behavior, and to develop technology that multiplies the individual's effective power in the environment. The explanation is coherent and well supported. What it does not fully resolve is the pace at which this metabolic investment developed, which the fossil record suggests occurred substantially faster than the gradual accumulation of small selective advantages would typically predict. The behavioral modernity transition, dated by archaeologists to approximately 50,000 years ago, represents a point in the human record where the material evidence for symbolic thought, long-distance trade, systematic planning, and artistic expression appears with a suddenness that has been called the Great Leap Forward by scholars including Jared Diamond. Before this transition, the archaeological record of anatomically modern humans, who had existed for at least 100,000 years prior, shows relatively limited evidence of the cognitive behaviors that define modern human culture. After the transition, the record changes dramatically. Cave paintings of extraordinary sophistication, personal ornaments indicating identity and status, blade tools requiring complex multi-step manufacturing sequences, evidence of seasonal planning and resource storage. The transition is not absolute, and earlier examples of symbolic behavior have been found that push its origins back, but the concentration of evidence around 50,000 years ago remains a feature of the record that invites explanation. Genetic research has added layers of complexity to this picture that were not available to earlier generations of scholars. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome by Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published in 2010, established that anatomically modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, with non-African modern humans carrying approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. The subsequent identification of the Denisovans, a separate hominin population known primarily from a finger bone and several teeth recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia, added a further genetic contributor to the modern human genome. With populations in Melanesia and Australia carrying up to 6% Denisovan DNA, modern humans are, genetically, a mixed population, carrying the biological inheritance of at least 3 distinct hominin lineages, whose full functional implications are still being characterized. The evidence hints at a picture of human origins considerably more complex than the simple linear progression from archaic to modern that older models proposed. Modern humans did not simply replace earlier hominin populations. They interbred with them, incorporated their genetic contributions, and emerged from the process carrying a genome assembled from multiple sources. This is not, it should be carefully noted, evidence for the Atrahasis creation narrative in any literal sense. The genetic mixing documented by modern paleoanthropology occurred between hominin populations through ordinary biological processes, not through divine intervention. What it does establish is that the human genome is genuinely composite, assembled from multiple contributing lineages in a pattern that is unusual among closely related species. Perhaps what is most striking when you set the Akkadian creation terminology alongside the modern genetic findings without forcing a correspondence between them is the structural similarity of the frameworks. Both describe a human being as a composite entity, assembled from pre-existing components that came from different sources, whose combination produced something that did not exist in any of the contributing elements individually. The Atrahasis describes clay plus divine essence, producing a being whose cognitive capacity exceeded its functional design. Modern genetics describes the mixing of multiple hominin lineages, producing a species whose behavioral complexity exceeds what any single contributing lineage demonstrated independently. The frameworks are separated by 4,000 years and fundamentally different epistemological traditions. The structural resonance between them is one of those details that rewards patient attention without requiring a definitive conclusion. The silence of the fossil record on the inner experience of these transitions is absolute and probably permanent. We can read the bones and the tools and the genome, but the moment of transition, the subjective experience of a species becoming aware of itself in a new way, leaves no physical trace that current methods can detect. That particular mystery rests beneath a layer of time that our instruments cannot yet penetrate. The Babylonian city, as the Akkadian tradition conceived, it was not simply a human settlement. It was a terrestrial reflection of a celestial order. Each major temple oriented and positioned to maintain a correspondence between the earthly and the divine that was understood as both cosmologically necessary and practically beneficial. The relationship between city planning and astronomical observation in ancient Mesopotamia is documented in cuneiform texts with a precision that removes any ambiguity about whether the correspondence was intentional. It was. The question that remains productively open is how deeply the astronomical encoding goes, and whether the knowledge required to achieve it implies a tradition of sky observation older than the earliest surviving written records. The Akkadian word for the Anunnaki's realm, shame, meaning heaven or sky, served as both a theological category and a geographical description. The Anunnaki were sky beings not merely in the sense of inhabiting an abstract divine realm, but in the sense of being specifically associated with identifiable celestial objects whose movements could be tracked, predicted, and interpreted. The planet Jupiter, called Nibiru in Akkadian astronomical texts, meaning the crossing point or the ford, was identified with the god Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. The planet Venus, called Dilbat, was Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Saturn, Kayamanu, was associated with Ninurta, god of agriculture and the south wind. Mars, Zalbatanu, was Nergal, lord of the underworld. This planetary theology was not decorative. It was operational. The movements of the planets through the zodiacal constellations were read as communications from the divine beings those planets embodied, and the interpretation of those communications was the specific professional responsibility of the Tupsar Enuma, Anu Enlil, the scribes of the Omen series, Enuma, Anu Enlil, a massive compilation of celestial omens running to approximately 70 tablets and constituting the most comprehensive astrological reference work of the ancient world. The Omen series assigned specific terrestrial consequences to specific celestial configurations. The appearance of Jupiter in a particular constellation predicted royal success or failure. The conjunction of Venus with the Pleiades indicated specific agricultural or political outcomes. A lunar eclipse on a specific calendar date required specific ritual responses to neutralize its predicted effects. The ziggurat at Babylon, the Anunnaki, whose 7 stages corresponded to the 7 celestial spheres of Babylonian cosmology, served as both astronomical observation platform and cosmological model simultaneously. Its 7 stages were associated with the 7 known planetary bodies: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, in the sequence that Babylonian cosmology assigned them from the ground upward. Climbing the ziggurat was, in the theological imagination of its builders, moving through the celestial spheres toward the realm of the highest divine beings. The observation platform at its summit, approximately 90 meters above the city floor, provided astronomers with an unobstructed 360-degree view of the horizon, essential for the systematic recording of planetary rising and setting positions that the omen tradition required. The orientation of Babylonian temple complexes to specific stellar targets is documented in the cuneiformist Wayne Horowitz's detailed study, Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography, published in 1998, which traces the astronomical logic embedded in the city's sacred geography with considerable precision. The Asagula temple's main axis aligns with the rising point of the star Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation the Babylonians called the Great Lion, associated with kingship and with Marduk's authority over the divine assembly. This alignment, maintained through multiple rebuilding phases of the temple complex across centuries, reflects an astronomical intention that the temple's builders considered worth the considerable practical effort of maintaining through structural changes. Beneath the visible architecture, beneath the orientations and alignments that modern archaeoastronomers have measured and confirmed, lies a layer of symbolic encoding that the restricted Nisirtu texts suggest was understood differently by different levels of the scribal hierarchy. The outer meaning of the ziggurat's 7 stages was the correspondence with the 7 planetary spheres, available to any educated Babylonian who knew the cosmological tradition. The inner meaning, preserved in the esoteric commentary texts, concerned the specific mechanics of divine descent, the process by which the Anunnaki moved between the celestial realm and the earthly realm using the temple as the point of transition. The Etemenanki's name, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, encodes this function directly. It was not simply a representation of the cosmic mountain connecting heaven and earth. It was understood within the temple's inner scholarly tradition as an actual functional connection, a structure whose specific dimensions, orientations, and ritual activations maintained the channel through which divine presence entered the human world. Whether this understanding reflects genuine, preserved knowledge of ancient practices, theological elaboration of astronomical observation, or some combination of both, remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of Mesopotamian religious studies. The stars above Babylon tonight are the same stars the Babylonian astronomers tracked from their observation platforms. Jupiter moves through the same zodiacal constellations on the same schedule that the Tupsar scribes recorded in their omen tablets. The sky has not changed. What has changed is the interpretive framework we bring to it, and the question of which framework recovers more of what the ancient observers actually understood remains, with appropriate patience, still open. Preserved among the cuneiform tablets of the British Museum is a category of Babylonian scholarly document that mainstream Assyriology has studied with careful attention, and that popular treatments of Mesopotamian mystery have sometimes overstated, but whose existence is not in dispute, and whose content raises genuine questions about the depth of what the Babylonian scribal tradition understood and chose to communicate only partially in its public literary productions. These documents are the Nisir II texts, the secret or restricted tablets, explicitly marked with colophon notations indicating that their content was not to be shared with the uninitiated, that the initiated should be cautious about how and to whom they communicated what the tablets contained. The markings are specific. Secret of the great gods. The initiate may show it to the initiate. The non-initiate may not see it. The existence of restricted scholarly texts in Babylonian scribal culture is established fact, documented in the work of Assyriologist Francesca Rochberg of the University of California, Berkeley, whose research on Babylonian astronomical and astrological scholarship has done more than any other single body of work to clarify the relationship between observational science and theological interpretation in the Mesopotamian tradition. Rochberg documents that the Babylonian scholarly class maintained a clear distinction between exoteric knowledge available to educated laypeople and esoteric knowledge, reserved for those who had undergone specific initiatory training within the temple's inner scholarly circles. What the restricted text generally concerned is itself a matter of scholarly debate. The clearest cases involve technical, astronomical, and astrological knowledge, whose predictive power was understood as conferring significant political and economic advantage on those who possessed it. A court astronomer who could reliably predict lunar eclipses 6 months in advance held information that had genuine strategic value in a world where celestial events were understood as divine communications affecting military and political outcomes. Restricting this knowledge to a trained priestly class maintained the temple's institutional authority and the astronomer's professional indispensability. But the restrictions extended beyond technical astronomy into theological territory that the exoteric tradition handled differently at its surface level. The Mukalimtu, the explanatory commentary texts that provided inner interpretations of standard literary works, including the Enuma Elish and the Atra Hasis, sometimes offered readings of the creation and cosmological passages that diverged significantly from the straightforward theological narrative available in the base texts. Scholars including Ulla Koch-Westenholz have noted that these commentaries occasionally treat the Anunnaki's actions in the creation narrative not as divine decisions operating within a sacred cosmological order, but as events with specific historical causes and consequences, events whose full significance was obscured in the public versions of the texts. One interpretation of this layering holds that the Babylonian scribal tradition was simply being appropriately cautious about the social effects of sharing complex theological ideas with populations not trained to contextualize them properly. This is a reasonable institutional behavior, recognizable in every tradition that has maintained distinctions between popular and specialist knowledge. The restriction would then reflect pedagogical conservatism rather than concealment of anything operationally significant. A second interpretation, argued by scholars working within the tradition of Assyriological esotericism, holds that the restrictions protect knowledge whose content was genuinely different from what the surface text presented. Knowledge about the actual nature of the divine-human relationship, about the mechanics of the creation, about the ongoing presence and activity of the Anunnaki in human affairs, that the temple authorities understood as either too destabilizing for general circulation or too practically powerful to share without the context that proper training provided. The shoot pie ritual, the opening of the mouth ceremony performed on Babylonian cult statues, preserves in its restricted technical instructions a set of procedures for activating a divine statue's capacity to serve as a vehicle for divine presence. The ceremony involved specific hand gestures, specific material applications to the statue's mouth and eyes, specific incantations in Sumerian and Akkadian, and a sequence of ritual actions performed in the temple's innermost sanctuary before witnesses sworn to confidentiality. The procedures were recorded in tablets explicitly marked as restricted, and their precise details are still subjects of scholarly reconstruction from surviving but fragmentary sources. What the ceremony implies is that the Babylonian temple tradition understood the boundary between the divine and material realms as permeable under specific controlled conditions, and that the techniques for managing that permeability were among the most carefully guarded of all the institution's specialized knowledge. Whether this reflected genuine metaphysical understanding, sophisticated psychological technology for inducing altered states in trained practitioners, or theological theater maintaining institutional authority, the texts do not resolve clearly. All three interpretations find support in different aspects of the evidence. The silence around what the innermost Babylonian scholarship actually contained is not the silence of emptiness. It is the measured quietude of things that were deliberately withheld, pressed into restricted tablets, and sealed behind initiatory requirements that the passage of 2,500 years has not fully dissolved. We are reading, in the surviving cuneiform corpus, what the Babylonian scribal tradition was willing to make public. What it kept private may still be recoverable in fragments, in commentaries, in the careful reading of what the restricted colophons themselves choose to say about what they are protecting. That layer of the tradition, the hidden dimension beneath the already remarkable visible surface of Akkadian scholarship, is where some of the most significant work in contemporary Assyriology is quietly being conducted, one fragment at a time, with the patient deliberateness that the material requires and rewards. The three interpretive frameworks for the Akkadian creation tradition have been circling each other in scholarly and popular literature for more than a century, each illuminating aspects of the texts that the others handle less comfortably, each carrying genuine intellectual weight, and none achieving the kind of decisive evidential advantage that would allow the conversation to close. Tonight we can hold all three frameworks simultaneously, not as a failure of intellectual rigor, but as an honest acknowledgement that the texts themselves were written to sustain multiple levels of meaning, and that forcing a single interpretation onto material deliberately constructed for depth is itself a kind of misreading. The first framework is pure mythology, and it deserves more respect than popular treatments of ancient astronaut theory typically afford it. On this reading, the Anunnaki are personified natural forces, their divine counsel a narrative device for explaining the origin of the world's current configuration, their fear of humanity, a theological mechanism for accounting for human mortality and limitation within a cosmological system that values both human dignity and human constraint. The Atrahasis on this reading is one of the ancient world's most sophisticated engagements with the problem of theodicy, the question of why beings created by powerful divine entities should experience suffering, limitation, and death. The answer it provides, that these conditions were deliberately imposed by a divine counsel operating with mixed motivations and imperfect foresight, is considerably more nuanced than the simple, omnipotent God loves humanity framework that later religious traditions would develop. Mainstream Assyriology, represented by scholars including Thorkel Jacobson, W. G. Lambert, and more recently Benjamin Foster of Yale University, works primarily within this framework without dismissing the text's sophistication. Foster's 2005 translation of the Atrahasis in his anthology, Before the Muses, presents the creation narrative as high literary art, carefully constructed, theologically serious, and engaged with genuine philosophical questions about existence, labor, and the relationship between created and creator. This reading does not require the text to be literally true to be profoundly meaningful. The second framework treats the Akkadian creation tradition as historical memory, compressed and symbolically encoded across millennia of oral and written transmission, but preserving genuine information about actual prehistoric events. This framework spans a wide range of positions, from the relatively cautious argument that the flood narratives encode real geological events, which mainstream geology now largely accepts, to the considerably more speculative argument that the Anunnaki were actual historical beings, either an advanced human civilization or, in Sitchin's version, an extraterrestrial species that intervened in human biological development. Perhaps the most honest position within this framework acknowledges that the conservative end of it, the reading of the texts as preserving genuine cultural memory of real environmental catastrophes and real historical encounters, is well supported by archaeological and geological evidence, while the more radical versions involving literal genetic intervention remain without direct physical corroboration. We may never know whether the Akkadian creation terminology describes something that happened in a literal biological sense. The fossil and genetic record does not contain the kind of evidence that would confirm or definitively rule out directed biological intervention in human evolution, because the signatures of such intervention, if it occurred sufficiently far back in time, would be indistinguishable from the signatures of natural selection operating over the same period. This is not a gap in the evidence that future research will necessarily close. It may be a permanent epistemic limit on what physical investigation can establish about events in the deep human past. The third framework approaches the Akkadian creation tradition as humanity's oldest systematic self-examination, reading the divine figures not as external beings, but as projections of human psychological reality. and the creation narrative as an attempt to account for the most puzzling features of human inner experience. The sense of being both mundane and significant, both mortal and capable of transcendent thought, both a product of natural processes and somehow in excess of what natural processes seem designed to produce. On this reading, the Anunnaki's fear of humanity is a projection of humanity's own ambivalence about its capacities, the anxiety of a species that possesses cognitive tools powerful enough to destroy its environment, dominate other species, and contemplate its own extinction, tools whose power exceeds the wisdom required to deploy them responsibly. This third reading has the advantage of explaining why the tradition resonates so powerfully across cultures and across millennia, without requiring either theological acceptance or literal historical interpretation. It suggests that the Akkadian scribes were doing something recognizable as philosophy, examining the human condition with the tools available to them, which happen to be mythological rather than analytical, and arriving at insights that remain valid regardless of the literal truth of the narrative framework carrying them. What all three frameworks share is the recognition that the Atrahasis identifies something genuinely unusual about human beings, something that requires explanation beyond ordinary natural description. The disagreement is about what kind of explanation is adequate. That disagreement, sustained across centuries of serious engagement with these texts, is itself a testimony to the depth of what the Akkadian scribes pressed into clay and sent forward to us. Carry the central question of the Atrahasis out of Babylon for a moment and set it down in other ancient traditions, traditions that developed independently and left their own textual records of the relationship between creators and their human creation. What you find, with a consistency that rewards patient attention, is the same structural anxiety appearing in different cultural costumes, divine beings who make humanity or give humanity transformative gifts, and subsequently discover that what they have enabled exceeds what they intended to authorize. The pattern is not universal in every detail, but it is common enough across genuinely independent traditions that it constitutes a cross-cultural datum worth serious consideration. The Greek myth of Prometheus provides the most immediately recognizable parallel. Prometheus, one of the titans who predated the Olympian divine order, gives fire to humanity against the explicit prohibition of Zeus, the chief god. The fire is not simply a practical tool for warmth and cooking. In the deeper layers of the Greek tradition, it represents the divine spark, the capacity for technical intelligence and civilizational development, the quality that elevates humanity above the animal. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus is not proportionate to the practical consequences of humanity having fire. It is the response of a chief god who understands that something has been transferred to humanity that fundamentally alters the relationship between the divine and human orders. Perhaps the most striking detail of the Prometheus tradition is that Zeus does not simply take the fire back because he cannot. The gift, once given, is permanent. The Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis 11, dating in its written form to the first millennium, BCE, but widely believed by biblical scholars to draw on Mesopotamian sources, contains a passage that the Akkadian creation context illuminates in a specific way. The divine beings descend to observe humanity's construction project, and make a statement whose implications have occupied theological commentary for millennia. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The decision to disrupt humanity's unified project follows directly from this assessment. The disruption is not punishment for impiety. It is preemptive management of a capability the divine observers have identified as potentially unlimited. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That line, read alongside the Atrahasis' account of Enlil's sleeplessness before the vital noise of the human population, suggests a consistent cross-cultural recognition of the same quality in human beings. An open-ended cognitive capacity that does not recognize inherent limits in the way that specialized biological capabilities do. A cheetah's speed is extraordinary but bounded. A dolphin's echolocation is sophisticated but domain-specific. Human cognitive capacity, as both the Akkadian tradition and the Genesis narrative observe with evident unease, is not bounded or domain-specific. It is general, transferable, accumulative, and apparently without ceiling. The Hindu Mahabharata contains passages describing divine beings called the Devas, who, after various interventions in human affairs, become concerned that human practitioners of certain meditative and ritual disciplines are accumulating spiritual power sufficient to challenge the divine order directly. The response in several narratives involves divine intervention to disrupt the human practice before it reaches completion, a structural parallel to the Anunnaki's serial attempts to reduce human population before its cumulative vitality altered the cosmic arrangement. One interpretation suggests these traditions independently arrived at the same insight. Another suggests they share a common origin in a period of human prehistory, whose records have not survived in written form. We may never resolve which interpretation is correct. The evidence for independent invention is the geographical and temporal separation of the traditions. The evidence for common origin is the structural specificity of the parallel. The fact that it is not merely a general divine human conflict narrative, but a very specific story about cognitive capacity exceeding its authorized limits and generating divine administrative responses. General narratives about divine human conflict are genuinely universal and can be explained by independent invention. This particular narrative about limitless cognitive capacity requiring management by beings who created or enabled it is specific enough that the independent invention explanation begins to strain under careful examination. Maybe the most honest position is the simplest one. Something about the experience of being human across cultures and across deep time generates this particular story. The story of a being that was made for a purpose and became something more than that purpose. The story of creators who looked at what they had made and felt something complicated, something that was not simply pride in craftsmanship, but recognition of having set something in motion that exceeded their control. That story is being told tonight by the oldest written text in human possession, and it is being received by a listener whose cognitive capacity is precisely the quality those texts identified as the source of the divine unease. The mystery at the center of this tradition is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a mirror, polished by 4,000 years of patient scribal attention, reflecting something about human nature that the Akkadian scholars understood was worth preserving across every catastrophe that might threaten to obscure it. We may never know exactly what they saw in that reflection. But we are looking into the same mirror tonight, and we can feel, if we are paying attention, that the reflection looking back carries more depth than a simple functional tool was designed to possess. The Akkadian literary tradition did not end with the fall of Babylon to the Persian king Cyrus in 539 BCE. It continued, sustained by scribal schools that maintain their educational programs and their tablet libraries under Persian administration, under the Hellenistic successors of Alexander the Great, and well into the Parthian period, with the last known dated cuneiform tablet composed in 75 CE, more than 6 centuries after the political end of the Babylonian state. The tradition's longevity is itself a testimony to the depth of the institutional commitment to preserving it. Scribes who could have adopted the more convenient Aramaic alphabetic script for all purposes continued pressing cuneiform signs into clay for astronomical records, mathematical tables, and ritual texts, maintaining a writing technology nearly 3,000 years old because the tradition it carried was understood as too important to be discontinued simply for the sake of administrative convenience. The specific texts that concern us tonight, the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, were among the most actively copied and maintained compositions in the late cuneiform corpus. Temple libraries at Uruk, Babylon, and Nippur continued producing fresh copies of these works through the Seleucid period, dated to between 323 and 63 BCE, with scribal colophons indicating that the copying was understood as a sacred obligation rather than merely an archival function. A scribe who copied the Atrahasis was not preserving a historical document. He was maintaining a living theological text whose content remained relevant to the understanding of divine human relations in his own time, centuries after its original composition. When the last cuneiform scribal schools closed in the early centuries of the Common Era, the tradition passed into silence that lasted approximately 18 centuries. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia were buried under accumulating alluvial sediment, their mud brick walls dissolved by millennia of rain and flood into the surrounding soil, their tablet libraries sealed beneath meters of earth that preserved everything they contained with extraordinary fidelity. The knowledge pressed into those tablets did not deteriorate. It waited with the absolute patience of baked clay for the moment when human curiosity would dig down far enough to find it again. That moment arrived in the 19th century with a concentration of archaeological energy in the ancient Near East that was partly motivated by theological interest, partly by imperial competition between European powers for cultural prestige, and partly by the straightforward human desire to know what was buried under those ancient mounds. Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, Paul Emile Botta's work at Khorsabad beginning in 1843, and the systematic excavations at Nippur conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, collectively recovered hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets and brought them to museums in London, Paris, Philadelphia, Istanbul, and Baghdad, The decipherment of cuneiform, achieved through the work of scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert in the 1850s, opened access to a literary tradition whose existence the educated world had entirely forgotten. Even now, the translation and analysis of the recovered cuneiform corpus continues at a pace that reflects both the vastness of the material and the limited number of scholars trained to work with it. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a collaborative project between the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, has digitized approximately 340,000 cuneiform tablets from collections worldwide, making them available for scholarly analysis using computational tools that were not available to earlier generations of Assyriologists. New readings of familiar texts emerge regularly as improved photographic techniques reveal signs that centuries of accumulated surface patina had obscured. New tablets from museum storerooms, identified and matched with known compositional fragments, periodically add passages to texts that had previously been read only in incomplete versions. Still today, archaeological fieldwork in Iraq, when security conditions permit, continues recovering tablet material from sites that were only partially excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The site of ancient Girsu, modern Tello, has yielded significant new tablet material in recent years through excavations conducted by the British Museum in partnership with Iraqi authorities. The site of ancient Nippur still holds, by conservative estimates, centuries of unexcavated archival material in areas that have not been reached by previous excavations. The tablets being recovered from these ongoing projects include administrative records, literary compositions, and scholarly texts whose content has not been read since approximately the 2nd century BCE. The Akkadian tradition's most durable legacy is not, however, preserved in clay. It is preserved in the religious and philosophical traditions that developed in direct dialogue with Mesopotamian thought across the first millennium BCE. The Hebrew Bible's creation and flood narratives carry the structural imprint of Akkadian predecessors that biblical scholars have traced with considerable precision since the late 19th century. The concept of humanity bearing the divine image, expressed in Genesis 1:26 as humans made in the Tselem and demute of God, uses terminology whose Akkadian cognate Tsalmu appears in Mesopotamian texts describing the divine element incorporated into the human constitution at creation. The theological question of why mortality was imposed on beings bearing divine qualities runs from the Atrahasis through the Epic of Gilgamesh into the Hebrew wisdom tradition, into early Christian theology's engagement with the problem of human fallibility, and into Islamic cosmology's careful treatment of humanity's unique status as the bearer of divine trust. Even now, the philosophical question the Atrahasis raises continues generating serious engagement in contexts entirely removed from ancient Near Eastern studies. Cognitive scientists studying the evolution of consciousness, philosophers of mind examining the relationship between biological substrate and subjective experience, evolutionary biologists trying to account for the specific features that distinguish human cognition from that of closely related species. All are working from different methodological starting points On versions of the same question, the Akkadian scribes pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. What is the quality in human beings that makes us what we are? Where did it come from, and why does it feel like both a gift and a burden simultaneously? The stars above the ruins of Babylon tonight are unchanged from the stars that Babylonian astronomers tracked from the summit of the Anunnaki. Jupiter moves through its 12-year cycle with the same stately precision that the Tupsar scribes recorded in their omen tablets. The Milky Way arcs overhead with the same density of light that it showed to the temple astronomer who read the Atrahasis by lamplight and paused over the passage about divine fear. The sky does not require our attention to continue its ancient mathematics, but it rewards attention with the same patterns that the Akkadian tradition encoded in its planetary theology, patterns that connect the observer standing beneath that sky tonight to every observer who has stood beneath it across the full span of human history. The story that the Atrahasis began has not concluded. It continues in the ongoing scientific investigation of human origins, in the philosophical literature on consciousness and cognition, in the theological traditions that carry the Mesopotamian inheritance forward in transformed but recognizable forms, and in the quiet, persistent human habit of asking, in the last moments before sleep, the question that no tradition has yet answered with complete satisfaction. What exactly are we? That question was pressed into clay in Babylon 4,000 years ago and sent forward through time specifically for the moment you are in right now, in your room, in the dark, with the day behind you and the night around you, still carrying the cognitive capacity that the Akkadian tradition identified as the thing that made even the gods look twice. The tablets were written for you. The question belongs to you. And the wondering you are doing right now, in the quieting space between waking and sleep, is precisely the quality that the Atrahasis described as the excess, the thing that exceeded the design, the feature of human existence that turned a functional labor tool into something that sat up at night under the stars and asked where it came from. Come back gently to the room you are in. Feel the specific weight of your body where it rests, the warmth of the surface beneath you, the particular quality of the air around you right now. You have traveled a considerable distance tonight through the divine councils of ancient Babylon, through the labor disputes of the Igigi, through the clay-mixing chambers where something was added to the human constitution that its architects had not fully anticipated. None of that requires anything from you now. No conclusion, no position, no resolution of the questions we carried through the dark together. You can set them down the way you might set down a clay tablet you have been reading by lamplight, carefully, with respect for what it contains, resting it beside you without requiring it to yield its final meaning tonight. The ruins of Babylon are there right now, in the Iraqi lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, approximately 85 kilometers south of modern Baghdad. What remains above ground is modest. Eroded mud brick mounds, the ghost of the processional way beneath accumulated soil, a few reconstructed walls from a 20th century restoration project. Beneath the surface, in the undisturbed layers that archaeologists have not yet reached, the tablet libraries of the Esagila temple complex may still hold texts that have not been read since the Parthian period. They are resting in the dark and the dry, and the patient compression of 20 centuries of overlying soil, holding whatever they hold, entirely indifferent to whether anyone reads them this century or the next. The Euphrates still runs. It has shifted its course since the Babylonian period, moving several kilometers to the west of its ancient channel. But it carries the same water from the same mountains, through the same alluvial plain, toward the same gulf that the Akkadian creation tradition described as the mixing of Apsu and Tiamat. The river does not remember what it witnessed. Rivers do not require memory to persist. They simply continue, carrying their sediment load toward the sea, depositing layer upon layer of fine silt over the ruins of every civilization that built along their banks, preserving what they cover with the unhurried thoroughness of geological time. Jupiter is visible tonight, or will be soon, moving through whatever constellation currently hosts it on its 12-year circuit of the sky. The Babylonian astronomers, who called it Neberu and associated it with Marduk's authority over the divine assembly, tracked its position with instruments no more sophisticated than a trained eye and a graduated sighting rod, and achieved predictions accurate to within minutes of arc over multi-year periods. Their observational data is still used by historians of astronomy reconstructing the ancient sky. The planet continues its ancient mathematics entirely without awareness of having been watched, named, interpreted, and incorporated into a theology of divine fear and human potential that outlasted the civilization that produced it by several thousand years and counting. The question the Atrahasis pressed into clay, the question about what was added to the human constitution and why it produced something that exceeded its design, belongs to no single tradition and no single era. It surfaces in every period of human intellectual history when the tools of inquiry become sharp enough to turn back on themselves, when the mind becomes curious about its own origin and nature with sufficient seriousness to press the question past comfortable answers. We are in one of those periods now, with neuroscience and genetics and philosophy of mind all circling the same territory from different directions, all arriving at versions of the same productive uncertainty that the Babylonian scribes encoded in their creation narrative 4,000 years ago. The clay tablets are still being translated. New fragments surface in museum storerooms, matched with known texts, yielding passages that have not been read since the 2nd century BCE. The conversation the ancient scribes began is not finished. It is simply moving slowly, at the pace that careful scholarship and rare expertise impose, adding a sentence here and a recovered passage there to a body of knowledge that the Akkadian tradition intended to be inexhaustible. Let your breathing slow now, fully and without effort. The questions are not going anywhere. They have survived the fall of Babylon, the burning of Nineveh, 18 centuries of burial, and the full turbulent span of modern history. They will be here tomorrow and the day after, patient as baked clay, waiting with the absolute equanimity of things that have already outlasted everything that seemed more urgent than they were. The wind moves over the ruins of Babylon tonight, carrying fine dust from the eroded mud brick across the flat southern plain. The stars continue their ancient circuits above the same landscape, where the Igigi once dug the rivers and the gods once looked down at what they had made. And somewhere in the dark beneath the surface, in the layers that no excavation has yet reached, the tablets rest in their long, undisturbed quiet, still holding the oldest question humanity ever pressed into clay, still waiting, still